The California sun rose brilliantly over Suncrest Beach, illuminating the vast expanse of golden sand that stretched for miles. It was the kind of day that travel magazines dreamt of: clear skies, a warm breeze, and waves breaking in perfect rhythm. Families arrived early, dragging coolers, umbrellas, and folding chairs as children darted ahead with bright-colored kites and frisbees. The air buzzed with laughter, and the smell of coconut sunscreen mingled with the salty tang of the ocean. From a distance, it seemed like paradise. But like all paradises, Suncrest Beach had its secrets. The locals, of course, had their superstitions about the place. Tourists came for the sun and surf, but those who lived nearby avoided the area during the early hours of the morning or when the tide was especially low. Old-timers at the docks often muttered about things buried deep beneath the sand, warning anyone who would listen about the whispers of the sea. Most dismissed their stories as the ramblings of bored fishermen. But for all the skepticism, it was hard to ignore how some visitors to Suncrest Beach never made it home. On this particular morning, a group of teenagers set up camp near the dunes. They had come for a day of surfing and bonfires, eager to enjoy one last adventure before college scattered them across the country. Among them was Clara, a photography enthusiast who never went anywhere without her vintage camera. She wandered away from the group to capture shots of the sunrise, her bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand. The further she walked, the quieter it became, as if the beach itself absorbed all sound. Clara stopped at the water's edge, focusing her lens on the horizon where the first surfers paddled out. She was so engrossed in her work that she almost didn't notice the figure in the distance. A man stood motionless near the shoreline, his back turned to her, staring out at the sea. Something about him was off. His posture was rigid, and he was dressed in clothes too heavy for a beach, an old-fashioned coat that looked like it belonged to another era. "Hey, are you okay?" Clara called out, her voice hesitant but loud enough to carry over the crashing waves. The man didn't respond or turn around. Instead, he stepped into the water, walking deeper and deeper until only his head remained above the surface. Clara raised her camera instinctively, snapping a photo. When she lowered it, the man was gone. By the time Clara returned to the group, her friends were already debating which surf spot to hit first. She told them about the strange man, but they dismissed it as a figment of her imagination. "Probably just some fishermen," said Jake, the self-proclaimed leader of the group. "They do weird stuff all the time." Still, Clara couldn't shake the image from her mind. She flipped through her camera's viewfinder to review the photos she had taken, but the frame where the man should have been was blank. It was as if the camera had failed to register his existence entirely. Uneasy, she decided not to mention it again. She didn't want to be the paranoid one who ruined the trip. As the day progressed, the beach grew more crowded. Vendors selling ice cream and souvenirs wove through the throngs of sunbathers, their cheerful cries adding to the lively atmosphere. The teens joined the surfers in the water, catching wave after wave as Clara stayed behind, photographing the scene. But as the tide began to recede in the late afternoon, the mood of the beach subtly shifted. A strange odor wafted through the air, sharp and metallic, like rusted iron. The waves seemed to crash harder, the water pulling back further with each cycle. Families packed up their belongings earlier than usual, and even the seagulls, which had been squawking loudly all day, disappeared without a trace. Clara's friends noticed it too. "It's probably just low tide," Jake said, though his voice betrayed a hint of unease. By sunset, only a handful of people remained on the beach. Clara insisted on staying to capture the golden hour, her favorite time of day for photography. The others reluctantly agreed, building a small fire in the sand to stave off the growing chill. As Clara aimed her camera at the horizon, she noticed something odd again. The waves that had been retreating all afternoon now surged forward suddenly, crashing much higher on the shore than they should have. That was when she saw it, a piece of driftwood bobbing in the surf. It was large and dark, almost black against the amber light of the setting sun. Clara felt compelled to retrieve it, wading into the water despite her friends' protests. When she reached it, she realized it wasn't just a piece of driftwood. It was a carved plank, weathered and splintered, but clearly inscribed with symbols she couldn't recognize. The markings were intricate, almost like runes, and in the center was a single word etched deeply: beware. Clara's heart raced as she carried the plank back to shore. The air felt heavier now, charged with an electric tension. She showed it to her friends, but no one could make sense of it. "Where did you find this?" Jake asked, his usual bravado replaced by genuine concern. "Just out there," Clara replied, pointing toward the water. But when they turned to look, the ocean appeared still, too still, as if holding its breath. And then, in the distance, a single figure emerged from the waves. It was the man from that morning, his soaked coat clinging to his frame as he stood unmoving, staring at them. This time, Clara wasn't the only one who saw him. The figure stood at the water's edge, barely distinguishable in the dim light of dusk. His presence was like a crack in reality, something that didn't belong on the otherwise serene beach. Clara and her friends froze, staring in silence as the man remained motionless. The waves lapped at his feet, but he didn't seem to notice. His face was obscured by shadow, but there was an unmistakable weight to his gaze, as though he could see straight through them. "Do you see that?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, her grip tightening on the plank she had retrieved. Jake nodded, stepping closer to the others as if to shield them. "Yeah, I see him. What's his deal?" His attempt at sounding brave fell flat, his words laced with unease. "Maybe he's hurt," suggested Sarah, the quietest of the group, though she made no move toward the man. Her eyes darted nervously between him and the darkening ocean. Clara's instincts told her this wasn't a person in need of help. There was something unnatural about the way he stood, like he was tethered to the beach itself. As the seconds stretched into minutes, the group realized that the man wasn't moving. He simply stood there, staring at them, or through them. Without warning, a faint sound broke the silence. It was a low, guttural whisper carried on the breeze, indistinct but chilling. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, each silently hoping someone else would claim they hadn't heard it. But the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer, as though the wind itself were speaking. "Leave." The single word rippled through the air, carrying with it a bone-deep chill that made Clara's skin crawl. She stumbled backward, clutching the plank tighter, while Sarah let out a small gasp. Jake, ever the skeptic, tried to laugh it off. "Okay, that's enough creepy beach vibes for one night. Let's go." But no one moved. It was as though the whisper had rooted them to the spot. The figure remained at the shoreline, unmoving, yet the atmosphere around him seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, almost oppressive, and the gentle sound of waves was replaced by a strange, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat echoing from the depths of the ocean. Finally, Clara snapped out of her trance. "We need to go," she said firmly, tugging at Sarah's arm. The others reluctantly followed, gathering their belongings as quickly as they could. The fire they had built still burned, but its flames seemed weaker, flickering unnaturally in the growing darkness. As they made their way up the dunes, Clara glanced over her shoulder one last time. The man was gone. The ocean stretched out in eerie calm, as if nothing had happened. Yet the whisper lingered in her mind, looping endlessly. "Leave." Back at their cars, the group huddled together, their earlier excitement replaced by a tense silence. "That was weird, right?" Sarah finally asked, her voice trembling. Jake shrugged, though his bravado had clearly taken a hit. "Just some lunatic messing with us. Probably trying to scare people off the beach." "No," Clara said sharply, cutting him off. "That wasn't normal. I saw him this morning. He walked into the water and disappeared." And now, she hesitated, unsure how to explain the whispers or the eerie stillness that followed. "You're overthinking it," Jake said, though his usual confidence sounded hollow. "Let's just head back to the hotel and forget about it. It's probably nothing." But Clara couldn't forget. As the group drove away, the beach disappeared into the rearview mirror, and with it, the strange events of the day. Yet the unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing mile. In the pit of her stomach, Clara knew this wasn't over. That night, as they settled into their hotel rooms, Clara stayed awake, scrolling through the photos on her camera. Every picture from the beach looked normal, bright, cheerful, and full of life. But when she reached the photo she had taken that morning, her heart skipped a beat. The frame where the man had stood was still empty, but this time, the ocean behind him wasn't. A faint shadow loomed beneath the surface of the water, its shape indistinct but undeniably there. It looked massive, stretching far beyond the shoreline, like something ancient and alive. Clara stared at the image, her fingers trembling as she zoomed in. The shadow seemed to pulse, almost as if it were breathing. And just as she was about to close the image, her screen flickered, and for the briefest of moments, words appeared over the photo in jagged, blood-red text. "We warned you." Clara dropped the camera, her breath catching in her throat. When she picked it up again, the screen was blank. The photo was gone. Morning came too quickly, bringing with it a bright, cloudless sky that seemed oblivious to the unease that hung over Clara and her friends. The hotel lobby bustled with tourists grabbing maps, chattering about trails, and planning their adventures. For a moment, Clara considered telling anyone, about what they had seen the night before. But how could she explain the whispers, the figure, or the shadow in the water without sounding like she had lost her mind? Jake, predictably, had shrugged off the previous night as weird, but not a big deal. He'd already convinced the others to spend the day exploring a nearby surf spot he'd read about online. "We came here for fun, not ghost stories," he quipped over breakfast, his confidence seemingly restored by the daylight. Clara wasn't convinced. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the moment when the words appeared on her camera. She hadn't told the others about it yet, partly because she wasn't sure they'd believe her, and partly because she wasn't ready to hear their reassurances that it had all been in her head. By the time they reached the new beach, Clara felt a creeping sense of déjà vu. The waves rolled in lazily, glittering under the sun, and the sand stretched on for miles. It should have been picturesque, but to her, it felt eerily still. Too still. Jake wasted no time grabbing a board from a rental shack and heading for the water, shouting for the others to join him. "I'll stay here," Clara said, setting up her towel under the shade of a driftwood log. Sarah hesitated, glancing at Clara before following Jake with a borrowed board of her own. That left Eric, who sat down next to Clara, his expression unusually serious. "You've been off all morning," Eric said quietly, pulling his knees to his chest. "What's going on?" Clara hesitated, her eyes scanning the waves for any sign of the shadow she had seen in her photo. She finally told him about the figure on the beach, the whispers, and the ominous message on her camera. To her relief, Eric didn't laugh or dismiss her concerns. Instead, he frowned, his brow furrowing deeply. "That's unsettling," he admitted. "You're sure it wasn't just a glitch? Like, maybe the camera—" "I know what I saw," Clara interrupted. "And it wasn't a glitch. It was real." Before Eric could respond, a scream pierced the air. Both of them turned toward the water, where Jake and Sarah were flailing in the surf. At first, Clara thought they were just messing around, but then she saw it. A dark, massive shadow moving beneath the waves, circling them like a predator. Panic gripped her as she scrambled to her feet. "Get out of the water!" she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. Jake and Sarah were already paddling frantically toward the shore, their movements clumsy and frantic. The shadow surged forward, its speed unnatural, its form indistinct but impossibly large. Jake reached the shallows first, collapsing onto the sand as Sarah stumbled out behind him, her face pale and streaked with tears. "What the hell was that?" Jake gasped, clutching his side as if he could barely breathe. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. It felt alive. It brushed against my leg." Clara's heart raced as she scanned the water. The shadow was gone, but the waves seemed restless now, churning as if disturbed by something deep below. Eric stood beside her, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. "We need to leave," Clara said, her voice firm. "Now!" Back at the hotel, the group sat in silence, each of them grappling with what they had just experienced. Jake was the first to speak, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet, shaken tone. "That wasn't a shark. It couldn't have been. Sharks don't move like that." "No, Sarah agreed, staring at her hands. It felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. Clara leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Jake. Do you believe me now? About last night? About the figure on the beach? Jake nodded slowly, his face pale. Yeah, I believe you. Clara exhaled, relief mingling with fear. She wasn't crazy. Whatever was happening wasn't in her head. But the question that lingered, unspoken between them, was far more chilling. What was it, and what did it want? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they had trespassed on something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. And for the first time since they had arrived, she wished they had never come to the beach at all. The room was eerily silent as Clara stared at the group, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the hotel coffee table. Despite the daylight outside, the heaviness in the air made it feel as though they were trapped in a dark, confined space. Clara's voice was measured, but the urgency beneath it was palpable. We can't keep ignoring this, she said, her eyes darting between her friends. Whatever is happening, it's not normal. And it's not going to stop. Jake leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. What do you suggest, Clara? We call the Coast Guard? Tell them we saw a shadow in the water and heard spooky whispers? They'll think we're nuts. Maybe, Clara admitted, but doing nothing isn't an option. That thing out there is not just some coincidence. We've already seen too much to pretend this is just random. Sarah, sitting on the edge of the bed with her knees pulled to her chest, looked up hesitantly. What if we're being warned? You know, like the whispers? Maybe it doesn't want us here. Then we should leave, Eric said, his voice sharp. He had been quiet since they left the beach, his unease growing with every passing hour. Whatever it is, it's making itself clear. We shouldn't stick around to see what happens next. Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You're all acting like this is some horror movie. Shadows? Whispers? It's creepy, sure, but it's not like we're cursed or something. But as Jake spoke, Clara's gaze drifted to Sarah's arm. What's that? She asked suddenly, pointing. Sarah blinked, confused, and looked down. On her forearm was a faint, jagged mark, like a bruise shaped by no human hand. It ran in a twisted line, resembling the spindly branches of a tree or the veins of a leaf. I don't know, Sarah stammered, her voice shaking. It wasn't there before. Eric moved closer, his expression darkening. That wasn't from the water, was it? It's too deliberate. Sarah shook her head, pulling her sleeve over the mark as though it might protect her. It's probably nothing. Maybe I scraped it on something. But Clara wasn't convinced. The mark felt deliberate, its pattern too unnatural to be accidental. She glanced around at her friends, noting their uneasy expressions. It's not just the beach, she said, her voice low. Whatever this is, it's following us. We can't just leave and expect it to stay behind. That evening, Clara couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that clung to her like a second skin. The group had decided to stick together in one room, not willing to admit aloud that they felt safer as a unit. They talked in low voices about what had happened, but no one had any answers. When night fell, the sound of the ocean became louder, as though the waves were crashing just outside their window. Clara's stomach churned as she peeked through the blinds and saw nothing but the empty parking lot. The ocean was miles away, yet its presence felt inescapable. It was Eric who noticed the second mark. As they sat on the floor playing a half-hearted game of cards, he rolled up his sleeve to scratch his arm and froze. There, just above his wrist, was a similar jagged line to the one Sarah had. No way, he whispered, staring at it. Let me see, Clara said, her voice tight. She leaned closer, examining the mark. It wasn't identical to Sarah's, but it carried the same unnatural design, twisting as if it had been etched by something alive. This isn't random, Clara said firmly, looking at the others. It's a message or a warning. Jake, who had grown increasingly agitated, stood abruptly. That's it. I'm out. I'm not staying here to be part of whatever creepy curse this is. You can all figure it out, but I'm leaving. Jake, don't, Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking. Splitting up is the worst thing we could do right now. But Jake was already grabbing his keys. I'll call you from the next town over. Maybe we're just too close to the beach or something. I'm not going to sit here and let this thing get to me. He was out the door before anyone could stop him. Clara stood, staring at the door as it clicked shut, a pit forming in her stomach. He's making a mistake, she murmured. Eric placed a hand on her shoulder. Let him go. He'll come back when he realizes this isn't something you can outrun. But deep down, Clara wasn't sure. As the sound of the waves grew louder and the faint whispers returned, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's choice had sealed his fate, and perhaps theirs as well. Jake's departure left an uneasy silence in the room. The tension between the remaining friends was palpable, each of them wrestling with a growing weight of fear and uncertainty. Clara sat cross-legged on the bed, her hands clutching her phone as if expecting a call from Jake at any moment. Sarah and Eric sat near the window, watching the darkened horizon, where the ocean seemed to hum with an unspoken energy. The whispers had begun again, faint but unmistakable, threading through the muffled roar of the waves. It was as though the ocean itself was alive, breathing, speaking in a language they couldn't understand. Eric shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the door. He shouldn't have left, Eric muttered, his voice tight. Whatever this is, it's tied to all of us. Running away isn't going to make it stop. Clara nodded but said nothing. Her thoughts were consumed by the eerie marks that now adorned both Eric and Sarah's arms. She glanced at her own skin, half expecting to find a similar pattern creeping across her body. But her arms remained unblemished, for now. As the minutes stretched into hours, the tension became unbearable. Finally, Sarah broke the silence, her voice trembling. We need to find out what's going on. Sitting here isn't helping. If it's tied to the beach, then maybe there's something there that can explain this. You're suggesting we go back? Eric asked, incredulous. After everything that's happened? What other choice do we have? Sarah shot back. If we don't, we're just waiting for whatever this is to take over completely. At least if we're there, we might find answers. Clara hesitated. The thought of returning to the beach sent a shiver down her spine, but Sarah had a point. The marks, the whispers, the shadow, and the water. It all seemed to originate from the shore. Perhaps the answers they sought were waiting for them there. We go together, Clara said finally, her voice firm. No splitting up, and we leave as soon as we see anything suspicious. The drive to the beach was unnervingly quiet. The once bustling streets of the coastal town were deserted, the lampposts casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. Even the usual sounds of nightlife, the distant hum of music, the chatter of late-night diners, were absent. When they arrived, the beach was shrouded in darkness, save for the pale glow of the moon reflected on the waves. The air was heavy with salt and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. The trio stood at the edge of the sand, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the darkness. Where do we even start? Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Near the water, Sarah said, stepping forward with reluctant determination. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the sand. The sound of the waves grew louder as they approached the shoreline, the whispers now unmistakable. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the area, her flashlight catching glimpses of driftwood and seaweed strewn across the beach. Then she saw it, a figure standing at the water's edge, silhouetted against the moonlit waves. It was motionless, its back to them, as if waiting. Is that Jake? Clara whispered, her voice quivering. Eric shook his head. It can't be. He left hours ago. But the figure turned, slowly, deliberately, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was Jake, or at least it looked like him. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes reflecting the moonlight in an unnatural way. He raised a hand, beckoning them forward. Jake! Sarah called out, taking a hesitant step toward him. Stop! Clara grabbed Sarah's arm, her grip tight. That's not him. The figure smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent chills down Clara's spine. It began to move toward them, its steps slow but purposeful. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the sand. Run, Clara said, her voice barely audible. Then louder, more urgent, run? They turned and sprinted back toward the car, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they stumbled over the uneven sand. The whispers became a cacophony, drowning out the sound of their own footsteps. Clara didn't dare look back, but she could feel the presence behind them closing in. When they reached the car, Eric fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. "Hurry!" Sarah screamed, her eyes wide with panic. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, the beach disappearing into the darkness behind them. But as they drove, Clara couldn't shake the image of Jake, or whatever had been wearing his face. She glanced at her reflection in the car window and froze. There, faint but unmistakable, was the beginning of a mark on her wrist, its jagged lines twisting like the roots of a tree. The drive back to the rental house was cloaked in a suffocating silence. The whispers that had haunted the beach seemed to follow them, lingering in the back of their minds like an unsettling melody. Clara sat in the back seat, clutching her wrist as if by sheer will she could prevent the mark from spreading. Beside her, Sarah was staring blankly out the window, her expression a mix of fear and exhaustion. Eric, gripping the steering wheel, focused intently on the road, his knuckles white. When they arrived, the house felt like an empty shell, stripped of its earlier warmth and comfort. Every shadow in the corners seemed deeper, every creak of the floorboards louder. As they filed inside, none of them spoke, each lost in their private thoughts. Clara moved to the bathroom, locking the door behind her as she turned on the sink. She rolled up her sleeve and examined the mark. It was unmistakable now, a jagged, branching pattern crawling up her wrist. The lines were faintly luminescent, glowing with a soft, otherworldly light. Her pulse quickened as she splashed water on her skin, hoping in vain to wash it away. But the mark remained, etched into her like a scar she couldn't escape. Outside the door, Sarah knocked gently. "Clara, are you okay?" Clara hesitated before answering. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice trembling. "You don't sound fine," Sarah replied, her tone soft but insistent. "Let me in." Clara reluctantly unlocked the door, stepping aside to let Sarah enter. Sarah's eyes immediately went to Clara's wrist, and her face fell. Without a word, she rolled up her own sleeve, revealing the same pattern, only more pronounced, stretching almost to her elbow. "It's spreading," Sarah said quietly. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. "What's happening to us?" Meanwhile, Eric sat alone in the living room, his gaze fixed on the television, though it was turned off. His thoughts churned with everything they had experienced: the whispers, the figure at the beach, and now the marks. He had tried to rationalize it all, to find some logical explanation, but the events defied reason. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, threading through the stillness of the house. Eric's breath hitched as he stood, searching for the source. His eyes fell on the sliding glass door that led to the patio. Beyond it, the ocean was visible in the distance, a dark, restless expanse under the moonlight. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow darting across the sand. But when he blinked, it was gone. He rubbed his eyes, wondering if fatigue was playing tricks on him. The sound of footsteps broke his concentration. He turned to see Clara and Sarah entering the room, their faces pale. Clara sat beside him, rolling up her sleeve to reveal the mark. Eric's stomach sank. "It's spreading," Clara said, echoing Sarah's earlier words. Eric looked down at his own arm, and sure enough, the marks were there, faint but unmistakable, creeping up like vines. "This is impossible," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Sarah leaned against the wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We need help," she said. "We need to find someone who can explain what's happening." "Like who?" Eric shot back, his frustration bubbling over. "Who's going to believe us? We can't exactly walk into a hospital and say, 'Hey, we've got glowing marks and ghosts chasing us.' Then what do you suggest?" Sarah snapped, her voice rising. "We just wait for this thing to take over completely?" Clara interjected, her tone calm but firm. "Enough. Arguing isn't going to help. We need answers, and we're not going to find them here." The three of them sat in silence, the weight of their predicament pressing down on them. Clara's mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of their nightmare. The whispers, the marks, the figure on the beach. It all seemed connected, but the threads eluded her grasp. Then she remembered something. The journal in the attic. The cryptic entry she had read the night before about the curse of the sea. What if it wasn't just the ramblings of a paranoid mind? What if it held the key to understanding what was happening to them? "We need to go back to the attic," Clara said, breaking the silence. Eric frowned. "What for?" "There's a journal," Clara explained. "It mentioned something about a curse. I didn't think much of it before, but now, I think it might be important." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. At this point, we have nothing to lose. Together, they made their way upstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. As they approached the attic, the whispers grew louder, as if the house itself was alive, aware of their every move. Clara hesitated at the door, her hand trembling on the handle. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. The attic was just as they had left it, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Clara moved to the trunk where she had found the journal, her heart pounding as she opened it. The journal was still there, its leather cover worn and cracked. She flipped through the pages until she found the entry she had read before. But as she skimmed the text, a new sentence caught her eye, one she was certain hadn't been there the last time. "The ocean takes what it is owed," it read, "and it never forgets." The attic felt colder than before, a chill that seemed to seep into their bones as they huddled around the journal. The dim light from a single bulb cast long shadows across the room, making the edges of objects seem to blur and shift. Clara held the journal in her trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the ominous phrase, "The ocean takes what it is owed, and it never forgets." What does that even mean? Eric muttered, his voice breaking the tense silence. He leaned over Clara's shoulder, his breath shallow. "I don't know," Clara replied, her tone edged with frustration. "But it's connected to this. I'm sure of it." She flipped back through the earlier pages, searching for context, but the entries were disjointed and cryptic, as though written by someone unraveling under the weight of a terrible secret. Sarah, standing near the attic door, shifted uneasily. What if it's not just words? What if this ocean, this curse, is tied to us now? The marks, the whispers, it's like it's claiming us. Eric scoffed, though his attempt at skepticism felt hollow. Claiming us for what? We haven't done anything. We're just here on vacation. Maybe that's the problem, Sarah shot back. What if we're intruding? What if this place has rules we don't understand? Clara shook her head, silencing the argument. This isn't getting us anywhere. Let's focus on what we do know. She pointed to an earlier passage in the journal, one written in hurried, jagged script. The sea chooses its own. Blood spilled on its shores binds the living to the dead. What does blood spilled mean? Sarah asked, her face paling. Eric frowned. You think it has something to do with those voices? The figure we saw on the beach? Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to the final pages of the journal. They were filled with frantic scrawls, as though the writer had been desperate to convey something before it was too late. Among the scattered words and phrases, one line stood out. The tide will rise for the chosen. The shore is a trap, but the depths hold the key. The phrase lingered in the air, heavy with foreboding. The depths hold the key, Clara repeated, her voice barely a whisper. What does that mean? Are we supposed to go into the water? Sarah recoiled at the suggestion. No way. Absolutely not. That thing, the figure, was in the water. We don't know what's waiting for us down there. But if it's the only way to stop this, Clara countered, do we have a choice? The marks are spreading. Whatever this is, it's not going to stop unless we do something. Eric rubbed his temples, his frustration mounting. This is insane. We can't base our actions on some old journal written by someone who clearly lost their mind. And what's your plan? Sarah snapped. Wait around until this thing consumes us completely? Because it's not going away. Eric, Clara closed the journal and stood, her resolve hardening. We need to figure out what's in the water. Maybe the tide pools, maybe further out. But the journal says the depths hold the key. That's all we have to go on? As they descended from the attic, the house seemed to groan under the weight of their decision. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering as though alive. The whispers were louder now, no longer just faint murmurs, but words they could almost understand. "Did you hear that?" Sarah froze at the bottom of the stairs, her head tilted as if listening. Eric and Clara stopped, straining to catch the sound. At first, it was indistinct, a low hum that seemed to emanate from the walls. Then, clear as day, they heard it come to the shore. The three of them exchanged a glance, fear etched into their features. Clara spoke first. "It knows we're trying to figure this out. It's drawing us in." Eric's jaw tightened. "Or it's a trap." "The journal said the shore is a trap, didn't it?" Clara nodded. "Yes, but if we avoid it, then what?" "The marks don't stop. The whispers don't stop. We're running out of time." Night fell quickly, the darkness enveloping the house like a shroud. Armed with flashlights and an uneasy determination, they made their way toward the beach. The wind howled as they approached the sand, the ocean's roar louder than it had been in days. The tide was high, the waves crashing violently against the shore. As they stepped onto the sand, the whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices calling their names, urging them closer to the water. Clara clutched the journal tightly, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the figure. Then she saw it. Standing at the water's edge, silhouetted against the moonlight, was the same shadowy figure they had seen before. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, an oppressive force that seemed to drain the air from their lungs. "What do we do now?" Sarah's voice was barely audible over the wind. Clara swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "We go closer. We need answers." With each step toward the water, the whispers intensified, and the figure became clearer. It was no longer just a shadow. It had formed a grotesque shape that defied logic. Its face, if it could be called that, was a mass of shifting features, as though it were wearing the faces of countless others who had come before them. The tide surged forward, lapping at their feet, cold and unrelenting. The marks on their arms glowed brighter, pulsing in time with the waves. The figure extended a hand, beckoning them into the depths. And then it spoke. "You belong to the sea now." The words echoed in their minds long after the figure disappeared into the churning surf. "You belong to the sea now." Clara, Eric, and Sarah stood rooted to the spot, the icy waves licking at their feet, as if the ocean itself were reaching for them. The air seemed heavier, laden with a strange energy that made it hard to breathe. "We can't just stand here," Clara finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was hoarse, a mixture of fear and resolve. "The journal said the depths hold the key. That means we have to go in?" Sarah looked at her in disbelief. "Are you insane? That thing just told us we're already claimed by the sea. What if going in is exactly what it wants?" Eric, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "She's right, Sarah. We don't have another choice. The marks are spreading. The whispers won't stop. If we don't act, this thing will consume us anyway." Clara took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the crashing waves. "We stick together. No matter what happens, we don't let go of each other." The three of them waded into the water, the cold piercing through their clothes and cutting to the bone. The marks on their skin glowed brighter with each step, pulsing like a heartbeat. As the water rose to their waists, the world around them seemed to shift. The sound of the waves faded, replaced by a deep, rhythmic thrum that resonated in their chests. Suddenly, the ocean floor dropped away beneath them, and they were plunged into the depths. Panic set in as they struggled to stay together, their hands grasping desperately in the dark water. The glow from their marks illuminated the surrounding gloom, revealing a strange, otherworldly landscape. The ocean floor was covered in shimmering sand that seemed to ripple like liquid silver. Strange, luminescent plants swayed in a current they couldn't feel, their tendrils stretching toward the intruders. In the distance, a faint light beckoned, its glow pulsating in time with the marks on their skin. "That has to be it," Clara said, her voice muffled by the water. It felt impossible, but somehow they could speak and breathe as though the ocean itself allowed it. As they swam closer to the light, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. But now they weren't just unintelligible murmurs. They were voices. Dozens of them, speaking all at once. Some begged for help, while others screamed warnings. Turn back. Too late. Save us. Run. The cacophony grew overwhelming, but Clara pushed forward, her eyes locked on the light. Eric and Sarah followed, their fear palpable but overridden by a grim determination. The source of the light came into view, a massive, coral-like structure that pulsed with an eerie bioluminescence. Embedded within its surface were dozens of faces, their features twisted in anguish. Some were human, others were not. Their eyes followed the trio as they approached, their mouths moving in silent screams. "What is this place?" Eric whispered, his voice trembling. "It's alive," Sarah said, horrified. "Those faces, they're trapped here. They're part of it." Clara reached out to touch the coral, but as her fingers brushed its surface, a sharp pain shot through her arm. She recoiled, clutching her wrist as the marks on her skin flared brightly. The coral pulsed, and the whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep, resonant, and filled with malice. "You seek the key, but the price has already been paid. The sea does not forgive." "What do you mean?" Clara shouted, her voice laced with desperation. "What price? What did we do?" The voice laughed, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. "Your bloodline carries the debt. The sins of the past are written on the tide. You cannot escape it." As the words faded, the coral began to shift, its tendrils extending toward them like living vines. Clara, Eric, and Sarah backed away, their hearts pounding as the structure seemed to come alive. "What do we do?" Sarah cried, panic overtaking her. Clara's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the journal's cryptic entries. "The depths hold the key," she muttered, her eyes darting around the coral. "The tide rises for the chosen. It's not just about us. It's about breaking the cycle." "What cycle?" Eric demanded, his voice rising. Clara turned to them, her face pale but determined. "This thing, it's feeding on us, on our fear, our blood, our connection to this place. If we don't stop it, we're going to end up like them." She gestured to the faces trapped in the coral. Before they could react, the ocean trembled, and a massive wave of energy surged outward from the coral, knocking them off their feet. The light grew blinding, and the voice boomed once more. "The sea takes what it is owed. Choose who will stay." The words struck like a physical blow, and the water around them seemed to constrict, holding them in place. Clara, Eric, and Sarah looked at each other in horror as the meaning of the demand became clear. "No," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "We're not leaving anyone behind." The coral laughed, its tendrils inching closer. "Then all will belong to the sea." The chapter ended with a choice looming over them, the weight of centuries pressing down as the ocean's grip tightened. The key to freedom was close, but so was the price of failure. The voices' demand echoed in their minds, reverberating like the toll of a death knell. Choose who will stay. It was a cruel ultimatum, one that struck at the core of their bond. The ocean's suffocating grip pressed against their chests as Clara, Eric, and Sarah faced the impossible decision. Clara shook her head violently, her eyes filled with defiance. "We are not playing its game. There has to be another way." The glowing coral loomed before them, pulsating with a sinister rhythm. Its tendrils swayed hypnotically, as if savoring their agony. Eric clenched his fists, his gaze fixed on the coral. What if it's lying? This thing thrives on fear. What if choosing someone to stay is exactly what it wants us to do to feed it? "That's a dangerous gamble," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The glow from the marks on her skin intensified, the pain now radiating through her entire body. "But we don't have time to argue. Look around us." The ocean was alive with movement. The shimmering sand beneath them began to swirl, forming a vortex that slowly dragged them closer to the coral. Around the vortex, shadowy figures emerged, half-formed, wraith-like entities that clawed at the water, their faces bearing the same marks that covered the trio's skin. Their mouths opened in silent screams, and their eyes were empty voids. Clara's thoughts raced, fragments of the journal flashing through her mind. It spoke of tides, of the chosen, of a cycle that bound the living and the sea. One passage stood out. When the tide calls, only a bond unbroken can quell its wrath. What if the bond is the answer? Clara said suddenly, her voice rising above the growing chaos. If we stay united, refuse to give in to its demands, maybe we can break the cycle. Eric looked at her skeptically, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. And what happens if we're wrong? If it takes all of us? Then at least we don't let it win by turning on each other, Clara said firmly. This thing feeds on fear and betrayal. Let's give it nothing. Sarah hesitated, the terror in her eyes warring with the trust she had in her friends. Finally, she nodded. Okay, together, or not at all. The three of them linked hands, their glowing marks aligning in a pattern that seemed almost intentional. The ocean shuddered, and the shadowy figures shrieked soundlessly, their forms twisting in anger. The coral pulsed violently, its tendrils lashing out toward the trio like living whips. As the first tendril struck, a surge of energy coursed through their joined hands. The glow from their marks flared brilliantly, creating a barrier of light that repelled the attack. The coral recoiled, its form trembling with what almost seemed like rage. The voice returned, deeper and more resonant than before. Defiance will not save you. The debt is eternal. Clara stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her heart. The debt ends here. Whatever pact was made, whatever sins were committed, they are not ours to carry. You don't own us. The coral began to crack, fissures spreading across its surface as the trio's marks glowed brighter. The faces embedded within it writhed, their mouths opening in unison to release a collective scream. The sound was deafening, a wave of anguish and fury that shook the very water around them. The vortex intensified, pulling the trio closer to the coral. But instead of fear, Clara felt a strange calm settle over her. She could feel the energy from their joined hands, a force that seemed to grow stronger the closer they were drawn to the source of the curse. "It's working," she shouted. "Don't let go." The coral lashed out again, its tendrils striking with desperate fury. Each blow was met with a barrier of light, now pulsating like a living heartbeat. The shadowy figures around them began to dissolve, their forms disintegrating into the shimmering sand. The coral let out one final, ear-piercing wail before shattering into 1,000 fragments. The ocean went still, the vortex collapsing in on itself. The glowing marks on their skin dimmed and finally disappeared, leaving only faint scars as reminders of their ordeal. The three of them floated in the now quiet water, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The oppressive energy that had filled the ocean was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. Slowly, they swam to the surface, the light of the moon guiding them back to shore. As they emerged from the water, the beach was unrecognizable. The bonfire was extinguished, the sand littered with fragments of the shattered coral. The air was heavy with silence, as if the world itself were holding its breath. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara looked at the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear. "We find out who made that pact. This isn't over. If the journal was right, this was just the beginning." Eric nodded, his expression grim but determined. "Whatever it takes, we'll make sure this curse doesn't claim anyone else." As the sun rose over the California beach, the trio stood united, their bond unbroken. But in the distance, the waves lapped against the shore with an almost mocking rhythm, as if the sea itself were whispering, "Not yet." The events of the night had left them with more questions than answers. The ocean's wrath had been quelled, but the underlying dread that hung in the air told them that their encounter with the supernatural was far from over. As Clara, Eric, and Sarah stood on the beach, the eerie calm that followed the destruction of the coral was unsettling. The sun had risen, casting its light on the remnants of the cursed coral, its shards now scattered along the shoreline like broken promises. Clara scanned the horizon. The sense of victory they felt after confronting the sea's wrath quickly turning into unease. There was something else at play here, something much larger than the coral, something deeper. "We stopped it for now," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of the waves. "But there's more to this. I can feel it." Sarah stood beside her, her face pale but resolute. "You're right. The journal, it mentioned a cycle, something about debts and punishments. What if this is just the beginning?" Eric, who had been pacing near the water's edge, looked back at them. His face was tense, his mind clearly racing. The cycle could be ongoing. There's more history to this place, more that we haven't uncovered yet. We need to find out who made this pact and why. The journal, the only source of information they had been cryptic, filled with riddles about tides, debts, and the wrath of the sea. As Clara flipped through its pages again, one sentence stood out. "The sands remember, and the dunes speak in whispers." She frowned, the meaning of the words hitting her with a strange intensity. It was as if the sands themselves were somehow connected to the curse, a living archive of the sins committed long before they had arrived. "It's not just the ocean we need to understand," Clara said, turning to Sarah and Eric. "The dunes, they're part of this. The journal isn't just about the water, it's about the land too. We need to find out what happened here, what has been buried under these sands." Eric nodded, his expression grim. "The dunes are more than just a landscape. They're a part of the island's history, its identity. Whatever happened here, it's tied to the earth itself." Sarah, ever the skeptic, wasn't so sure. "We're talking about ghosts, curses, and strange rituals. And now we're supposed to trust the sand to tell us what happened? How do we even begin to understand something like that?" Clara placed the journal down, the pages turning on their own, as if the book itself was urging them forward. "It's not about trusting the sand, Sarah. It's about listening. The sand is more than just an obstacle between us and the sea. It's a witness. It's been here long before we arrived. If we want answers, we have to learn to listen to it." The trio set off, walking deeper into the beach, their feet leaving imprints in the soft sand. The dunes loomed in the distance, their golden peaks rising like silent sentinels, waiting for something or someone to approach. With each step, Clara could feel a strange energy in the air, a subtle hum that seemed to pulse through the ground beneath them. It was as though the very earth itself was alive, its whispers just beyond their reach. The further they walked, the more surreal the landscape became. The sand seemed to shimmer, as if it were a mirage. At first, it was subtle, but soon it became impossible to ignore. There were figures hidden within the dunes, ghostly forms that flickered at the edge of their vision. Each time they looked directly at one, it would vanish, leaving only the impression of something that wasn't quite real. Eric slowed his pace, his gaze fixed on one of the shifting forms. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice low, almost frightened. Clara nodded. "Something's here. I can feel it." She stepped closer to the base of the nearest dune, the hum growing louder with each step. She knelt down, brushing her hand through the sand. To her surprise, it didn't fall away as she expected. It seemed to shift, to move of its own accord, as if something was buried deep beneath the surface. Suddenly, the earth beneath them trembled. A deep, rumbling sound emanated from the sand, a sound that seemed to come from the very core of the island. Clara jumped back, her heart racing as a dark shape began to emerge from the sand, slowly at first, then more quickly as if whatever it was had been waiting to be freed. The shape was humanoid, its form composed of sand and shadow, with glowing eyes that pierced through the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs stretching unervingly as it moved toward them. A voice, ancient and rasping, filled the air. "The debt is not yet paid. The sands remember." The figure's presence was overwhelming, its power almost tangible. Clara stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the glowing figure that now towered over them. What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice shaking. The creature tilted its head, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. "What was once taken must be returned. The debt cannot be erased, only fulfilled." Sarah took a step forward, her hand trembling at her side. "What does that mean? What debt?" The creature's voice echoed again, like the wind sweeping through the dunes. "The pact is sealed in blood and sand. Only those who walk the path can break the curse. The sand beneath their feet began to shift violently, as if the very land was responding to the creature's words. Clara stumbled back, pulling Sarah and Eric with her. The figure's form began to fade into the sands, its eyes lingering for a moment longer before disappearing entirely. As the tremors ceased, the trio stood in stunned silence. The sands were once again still, but the weight of what they had just experienced hung heavy in the air. The whispering dunes, it seemed, had more to say than they had ever imagined. "We need to find out what this pact was," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to know what was taken and how we can return it." Clara nodded slowly, her mind racing. The journal spoke of a debt that was never paid. This creature, it's tied to that debt. We have to uncover the truth, or the cycle will never end. As they turned to leave the dunes, the whispers of the sand seemed to follow them, a constant reminder that their journey had only just begun. The sea had been silenced, but the land was speaking now. Its voice was as old as the island itself, and it was not yet ready to let them go. The events of the past few days had become a blur. The warnings, the eerie whispers from the dunes, and the shadowy figure that had emerged from the sand left them with more questions than answers. Yet, Clara, Eric, and Sarah knew one thing for certain. They couldn't leave the island now. It wasn't just a matter of curiosity anymore. It was a matter of survival. Whatever pact had been made, whatever force controlled the land and the sea, it had been awakened, and it would not rest until its demands were met. The trio sat in a makeshift camp near the base of the dunes, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the sand. Clara held the journal in her hands, staring at the cryptic passages that seemed to mock her understanding. Every page was a riddle, a series of fragmented thoughts that made less sense the more she read them. Yet one part of the journal stood out. It spoke of a hidden place beneath the surface of the island, something buried long ago, something connected to the curse. This was the next step. They had to find it. Eric, ever the pragmatic one, paced restlessly as Clara read aloud from the journal. "We need to get below the surface, find whatever's hidden there. But how? The island is small. We've already seen most of it." Sarah, who had been quiet for some time, suddenly spoke up. "What if it's not beneath the surface of the island? What if it's beneath the surface of the water?" Clara looked at Sarah, a thought stirring in her mind. The ocean, which had been so restless, now seemed like the key to everything. The journal never specified, but it could be possible. The sea has always played a central role in this curse. We know that the coral, the sea creatures, even the tides, are all connected to the land in ways we don't fully understand. Eric stopped pacing and turned toward the water. The moonlight reflected off the surface of the ocean, casting a ghostly glow on the waves. If there's something beneath the water, we'll need to dive to find it. But are we even ready for that? We barely survived the last encounter with the sea. What if it's worse this time? Clara's eyes narrowed in thought. We have no choice. The creature from the dunes spoke of a debt, but it also mentioned a path. If the path is in the water, we have to follow it, even if we don't know where it leads. With a sense of determination, they made their way to the beach's edge, where the ocean seemed to whisper its own secrets. The waves lapped against the shore, rhythmically pulling back and forth, as if beckoning them to follow. The sea was a vast, unknowable entity, but Clara felt a strange pull, an unseen force urging them onward. As they waded deeper into the water, the cold shock of the ocean's embrace made them hesitate for only a moment before they continued forward. Clara had found an old, rusted diving mask and equipment buried in the sand earlier that day, abandoned by some long-forgotten soul. It was their only option. Sarah and Eric, though visibly uneasy, followed her lead, trusting Clara's resolve. The deeper they went, the clearer the water became. It was an unsettling clarity, as if the ocean was hiding something beneath its surface, something ancient. The pressure in their ears intensified as they descended, but Clara pressed on, her eyes scanning the ocean floor. It was dark, the shadows of the water stretching out in every direction, but there was something ahead, something faint, like a distant shape in the abyss. They swam deeper, the eerie feeling of being watched never far behind them. The creatures of the deep were silent tonight, the usual hum of life under the water muted. There was only the pressure of the sea and the sense that they were nearing something important, something long buried. And then they saw it. Just as Clara had feared, the earth seemed to give way beneath the water, revealing an entrance, a cave. The mouth of it was jagged and black, like a wound in the very fabric of the island. It was the shape of an opening, but it was unnatural, too smooth, too perfect. There were no tides here, no currents. It was as though the water itself avoided this place. "Is this it?" Sarah asked, her voice muffled by the diving equipment. Clara nodded. "This is where the path leads. We have to go in." They hesitated only for a moment before venturing inside. The water within the cave was eerily still, and as they swam deeper, it became unnaturally cold. The deeper they went, the more the cave seemed to close in on them. The walls were covered in strange, smooth markings, symbols that seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. Clara's heart raced as she tried to make sense of them. They looked ancient, perhaps even older than the island itself. It was clear that whoever had come here before them had left these marks as a warning or perhaps as a sign of something more. The further they swam, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The space inside the cave was small and narrow, and soon they found themselves drifting upward toward a narrow passage. They had no choice but to ascend. Clara led the way, her eyes scanning the walls for any sign of danger. As she reached the top, she gasped in shock. Before them, an ancient altar stood, covered in algae and barnacles. The altar was carved from the same stone as the cave walls, its surface worn smooth by time. But it was what lay atop the altar that sent a shiver through Clara's spine. There, lying in a pool of dark, stagnant water, was a small chest, wooden, intricately carved, and unmistakably ancient. The chest seemed out of place, as though it had been waiting for them all along. "This is it," Clara whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. This is what the journal was talking about. Eric approached the altar, his fingers brushing over the chest. But what's inside? And why did it take us this long to find it? The moment his fingers touched the chest, a sudden, overwhelming force surged through the water. Clara's body stiffened as the cave seemed to come alive, the walls vibrating with energy. The symbols on the walls pulsed faster, as though responding to something deep within the chest. It was then that Clara realized they weren't just opening a chest. They were unlocking something far older, something tied to the curse of the island itself. With a trembling hand, she reached for the chest. As her fingers brushed against it, the air grew colder still, and the water began to swirl violently around them. They had crossed the point of no return, and the consequences of their actions were about to become clear. The debt had not been paid, and whatever was inside this chest would demand the price. The chest had not been a mere object, it was a trigger. The moment Clara touched it, the very air around them shifted, charged with a palpable tension. The calm, eerie silence of the cave was broken by a low, rumbling sound, almost like a growl echoing from deep within the island itself. Clara's heart raced as she watched the chest begin to tremble, its surface cracking slightly, as if whatever lay inside was beginning to stir. Clara's instinct screamed at her to let go, to swim back to safety, but something held her in place. The altar before her, the chest beneath her fingers, and the strange symbols on the walls. Everything seemed to be converging, pulling her into a dark narrative written long before her time. She wasn't sure if she had been chosen or cursed, but at that moment, she realized she was no longer in control. The island had made its move. Eric, who had been silent until now, suddenly gasped, his wide eyes reflecting a mix of fear and disbelief. "What is happening?" he shouted, his voice muffled by the water. His hands clutched at the sides of the cave, as though searching for something solid to hold on to. But there was no escape. The cave seemed to close in around them, the very walls pressing inward as if reacting to the chest's awakening. Sarah, too, seemed affected. Her normally calm demeanor had been shattered by the growing chaos. She looked to Clara for answers, but Clara could offer none. All she could do was watch as the chest's lid began to lift slowly, creaking in protest as if a great weight had been released from within. The water around them seemed to darken, swirling in unnatural patterns, as though responding to the chest's contents. It wasn't just the chest that had awoken. It was the island itself, alive with ancient power. Suddenly, there was a shift. Clara felt an intense pull, a magnetic force tugging at her, not from the chest, but from the very depths of the water around her. She was no longer swimming. She was being dragged, pulled toward the center of the cave. Panic surged through her as she tried to fight against the force, but it was futile. The pull grew stronger, and soon, she realized the truth. It wasn't just the island that was alive. It was the curse, a sentient, controlling entity that had waited for centuries to be unleashed. Eric's voice was barely audible over the rushing sound of the water as he called out for Clara, but his words were lost in the chaos. He, too, was being pulled into the center of the cave, as though the water itself had become a trap. The surface of the water churned violently, and Clara could barely make out Sarah's silhouette as she fought against the current. But it wasn't the current that had changed. It was the nature of the water itself, alive and hungry. The chest, now fully open, released an eerie light that illuminated the entire cave. It wasn't a light in the traditional sense. It wasn't warm or comforting, but cold, sharp, almost alien. The glowing substance seemed to pulse with a life of its own, emanating from a mass of tangled roots that looked almost like seaweed, but black and sinister. The roots seemed to reach out toward the trio, coiling and twisting as though beckoning them closer. For a moment, Clara was sure she saw a face, just a flash, etched into the dark mass. It was human, but not quite human, its features distorted and otherworldly, as though it had been shaped by the curse itself. The face seemed to grin, mocking her, as though it knew that whatever it wanted from them was inevitable. A deep, resonating voice, not spoken, but felt in the pit of her stomach, filled the cave. "You have awakened the dead. The island will claim what is due." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The voice was not a mere sound. It was a presence, an ancient being speaking directly to her mind. It wasn't the voice of one individual, but many, a collective consciousness bound by the curse, trapped within the island for eternity. They had made a pact long ago, one that had been waiting to be fulfilled, and now it had been set into motion. The realization hit Clara with the force of a wave. The chest had not been the object of the curse, but the conduit. It was not just a chest, it was a prison. The curse was contained within it, a force that had been imprisoned for centuries, waiting for the right moment, the right trespassers, to release it. And now, Clara and her companions were the unwitting catalysts of that release. The water around them grew colder still, and Clara felt her limbs begin to numb as the roots began to inch closer. She could see now that the roots weren't just reaching for them. They were reaching for the island itself, for the heart of it. The chest had been the key to this dark power, and now it was on the verge of unleashing something far worse than they had imagined. Clara's mind raced. She needed to think quickly. This was no longer about simply finding answers. It was about stopping something that had been set in motion long before they had arrived. The island had a history, a story they had barely scratched the surface of, and they were now part of it. But how could they stop something so powerful, so ancient? Her eyes met Eric's, and she saw the same terror reflected in his expression. Sarah was struggling beside him, her movements growing weaker as the pull intensified. They needed to escape, but the path back was closing. The water around them had turned from a force of nature to an entity in its own right, a manifestation of the curse's power. Clara knew then that their only hope lay not in escaping the island, but in confronting what had been unleashed. They had to find a way to sever the connection between the curse and the island. But time was running out. The roots were nearly upon them, and the island had already begun to claim what was owed. There was no turning back now. The curse had awoken, and its demands would be met. Clara's thoughts raced in a blur as the dark roots crept ever closer. Her breath felt shallow, constricted by the weight of the moment. The water, once an innocent reflection of the cave's beauty, now pulsed with malice, its cold embrace turning each breath into an agony of desperation. Eric and Sarah were fighting against the pull, their bodies convulsing with the strain of their resistance. The deeper the roots slithered into the water, the stronger their grip seemed to become, an unseen force tightening around them. There was no time to think, only to act. Clara's fingers trembled as she gripped the rocky surface of the cave, trying to anchor herself to something solid. The glow from the chest cast long, twisting shadows along the walls of the cave, making it seem as though the darkness itself was alive, watching, waiting for them to succumb to its will. The voice, the one that had resonated in her mind earlier, returned, its deep, unsettling tone now accompanied by a chill that reached deep into Clara's bones. "The debt must be paid," it intoned, sending a ripple of unease through Clara's core. "The curse cannot be undone. It was bound long ago, and now it seeks what is owed." Clara's heart skipped a beat. The curse was not something they could simply escape. It had been tied to the island long before they had ever set foot here, an ancient pact made by people long forgotten. The chest, the altar, the symbols. All of it had been part of a larger, darker force that had woven itself into the very fabric of the island. She had thought the island was a mere backdrop to their adventure, a setting for a relaxing escape, but now she realized the island was a living, breathing entity with a will of its own, its power rooted in the very earth beneath their feet. A wave of dread washed over Clara as the full weight of the curse settled upon her. The island was not just a place, it was the trap, and they had triggered it. The roots continued their advance, growing thicker, their dark tendrils now brushing against her legs, sending electric shocks of panic through her. Eric let out a cry as he was pulled further into the water, his body sliding away from the safety of the rocks. Sarah, too, was losing her grip, her arms flailing in the water as she fought against the overwhelming current. Clara knew they had to act quickly. The curse was not just an abstract concept. It was a force of nature, a living, breathing power that was now playing with them like insects trapped in a web. It wasn't just the island that was alive. It was the curse itself, hungry for a price that had been withheld for centuries. And now, the price was due. "Clara!" Eric's voice pierced the rising panic. "Do something, please!" Clara turned toward him, her mind working furiously. What could she do? There was nothing in the cave, no weapon, no tool to fight against this supernatural force. The chest, whatever it held, was the key to understanding the curse, but she had no idea how to stop it. Was there a ritual they had to perform? A way to reverse the curse? Or was it simply too late? The question gnawed at her, but the truth was becoming painfully clear. The curse was ancient, and it had no intention of letting them go. As if to answer her unspoken question, the voice returned, this time clearer, more insistent. "You cannot escape. The curse is not a thing to be bargained with. It is not a debt to be paid. It is a demand, and you will fulfill it." Clara's chest tightened as the words sank in. There was no way out. The island had already begun its reclamation. It had chosen them, and now it was preparing to collect its due. The light from the chest intensified, casting an eerie, ghostly glow across the water. The roots had begun to curl, wrapping around Clara's legs, and she could feel them tightening with each passing second. The sensation was suffocating, as though the island itself was trying to pull her under, to drag her into the very heart of the curse. But then, in the midst of her terror, something shifted. Clara wasn't sure what it was at first. A faint glimmer of light, a ripple in the water, a shift in the air. But it was enough to make her hesitate. For just a moment, everything seemed to pause. The roots stopped moving, the water stilled, and even the voice seemed to fall silent. It was as if the curse had momentarily lost its grip, uncertain, confused. Clara took a sharp breath and, for the first time since the chaos began, felt a flicker of hope. The silence was brief, but it felt significant, like a crack in the armor of the curse. Her mind began to race again, pulling together the fragments of what she had learned, what she had seen. The chest, the altar, the markings, everything had been a clue, a piece of a puzzle. She couldn't just escape, but perhaps there was something else she could do. Perhaps there was a way to sever the connection between the curse and the island, to stop the cycle that had been set in motion centuries ago. But how? What had they triggered when they opened the chest? What had they awakened? The voice answered, as if reading her thoughts, its tone now dripping with malice. You have awakened the island's hunger. It will not be sated until it has consumed what it desires. Clara's mind went blank for a moment. The curse was not about revenge or a debt. It was about something darker, something primal. The island wasn't just alive. It was a predator, and it had been waiting, lying in wait for centuries, until the right moment, the right trespassers arrived to feed its hunger. And now, Clara realized with a growing sense of horror, she and her friends were the prey. Clara's mind raced as the grip of the curse tightened around her. The roots, once mere tendrils, now had a suffocating hold on her, slowly pulling her toward the dark abyss below. It felt like the ground itself was giving way, as though the island was swallowing her whole. She tried to pull herself free, but each movement only seemed to strengthen the roots' hold, as if they were feeding off her desperation. The air around her grew colder, and a strange, almost oppressive silence fell over the cave. Eric's cries echoed in her ears, but she could barely hear them over the roar of blood rushing in her head. Sarah, too, was in trouble, her once fierce resistance now a weak struggle against the unseen force. Clara could feel her energy draining, the oppressive darkness weighing on her chest, constricting her breath. The voice of the island, the curse, had quieted for a moment, but it still lingered in the back of her mind, like a shadow waiting to strike. This wasn't just an island. It was a predator, a sentient force that had been dormant for centuries, feeding off the lives of those who dared to come too close. And Clara and her friends had awakened it. The price, whatever it was already being exacted. The chest, the altar, the roots, all of it had been leading to this moment. The moment when they would be consumed by the very island they had thought was merely a backdrop for their adventure. For a brief, fleeting moment, Clara wished they had never come here. The thought of how close they had been to safety, the idyllic beach, the peaceful waves, now felt like a distant, unattainable dream. If only they had left sooner, if only they had never opened the chest, if only they had listened to the warnings of those who had come before them. But now, there was no turning back. The roots were pulling them into the water, into the darkness that awaited beneath the surface. Clara glanced toward the chest again, its light now pulsing ominously, almost as if it were alive. It had been the catalyst, the trigger that set everything in motion. But Clara could feel something else, too, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a whisper that had nothing to do with the voice of the island. It was the chest, or rather, what the chest had revealed. There was something more here, something that could still be used, something they could still fight with. The island was old, ancient even, but Clara knew that it had been built on a system of rules, of rituals, of powers that could be manipulated. The curse was not a random occurrence. It had been designed, woven into the very fabric of the island. Perhaps, just as the curse had a pattern, there was a way to break it, to turn the tables and wrest control back from the island's clutches. But it wouldn't be easy. She needed to act quickly. The roots were closing in, and Sarah and Eric were nearly submerged in the water. She could see the fear in their eyes, the terror of being consumed by something far more ancient and powerful than they could comprehend. Clara had never felt so helpless in her life. The island wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was more alive than any of them had realized. As Clara struggled to think, a sudden realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. The chest was the key, not just because it had released the curse, but because it held a deeper power. She had seen something in the chest, something buried beneath the surface. The ancient markings, the symbols, they were part of a larger ritual, a set of instructions that had been waiting for the right moment to be unlocked. The chest wasn't just a container for the curse. It was a vessel, one that contained both the source and the solution. But to access it, Clara would need to do something drastic. She would need to risk everything, perhaps even her own life, to break the curse. She wasn't sure how, or even if it would work. But with the island closing in on them, she realized that there was no other option. It was the only chance they had left. "Eric, Sarah," Clara shouted, her voice shaking with fear, but also with determination. She had to keep them focused, had to make them understand that there was still hope. "I need you to trust me. Hold on just a little longer. I think I can stop this." Eric's voice was weak, strained by the water rising around him. "What are you going to do? We can't fight this. We can't escape." "I don't know yet," Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I have an idea. I think the chest is the key. We have to figure out how to use it, how to turn the curse back on itself." The thought of even trying to outwit the curse felt insane, but Clara couldn't help but hold on to that thread of hope. They had no other choice. She could feel the weight of time pressing on them, the roots tightening, pulling them deeper into the island's grasp. The chest had to be the answer. The air around them seemed to thicken, and the voice of the curse grew louder in Clara's mind. "You cannot defeat what has always been. You cannot outrun time. Your debt has been paid." But Clara refused to listen. She couldn't give in. Not now. Not when they were so close. With one last effort, Clara pulled herself toward the chest, using every ounce of strength she had left. The roots tangled around her, but they couldn't stop her. Not yet. As her hand brushed against the chest, a sudden surge of energy pulsed through her. The world seemed to warp and shift, and Clara felt herself being drawn into the heart of the island, deeper than she had ever gone before. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. The curse was not finished with them yet. It had only just begun. The pulse of energy that Clara had felt when her hand touched the chest reverberated through her entire body. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was as though her very soul had been lifted, pulled from her body, and thrown into a void. The world around her blurred as she found herself at the center of an otherworldly realm, one that seemed to defy logic and physics. The island, the water, the roots, and the chest were no longer real to her in the way they had been just moments before. They were now merely fragments of a larger, more ancient truth. Clara's mind spun as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She had expected to find answers in the chest, perhaps even to break the curse. But this was beyond anything she could have prepared for. She wasn't just on an island anymore. She was in the heart of something far more ancient, something that had been hidden from the world for millennia. The chest wasn't just a container for the curse. It was a doorway to the island's true nature, to its origins, and to the force that had guided it all. She could see them now, the silhouettes of countless figures moving just beyond her reach. Shadows of people, of ancient beings, that seemed to watch her with a knowing gaze, as if they had been expecting her all along. Some were humanoid. Others were forms that defied any rational description, their bodies twisting and contorting in ways that sent a chill through Clara's spine. These were not ghosts, not spirits. They were something older, something that had existed long before human memory. The island had not always been a beautiful, serene place. It had been a cradle for something far darker, a place where rituals were performed, rituals that involved the sacrifice of life itself. This had been a place of power, a place where beings like the ones Clara saw had once walked freely, manipulating the forces of nature, controlling life and death. The chest had been the key to their return, a relic from an age that had long since passed. But its power was not to be taken lightly. Clara felt a sudden surge of panic. She hadn't understood the full depth of what she had unleashed. This was not just about a curse. It was about restoring an ancient order, one that had been lost to the sands of time. And in her ignorance, she had disturbed something that could not be controlled. The very forces of nature seemed to turn against her now, as if they recognized the disruption she had caused. The island was alive, but it was not her ally. It was her adversary. She could hear Eric and Sarah's voices now, faint and distant, like echoes from another world. They were still trapped in the water, struggling to survive against the crushing weight of the curse. Clara had to act. There was no time to waste. The chest had to be closed. But how? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that she had to find a way back to the physical realm, to the island, and stop the chain of events she had set in motion. As Clara attempted to move, she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to break free from the pull of the shadows that surrounded her. The figures watching her seemed to close in, their silent presence growing more oppressive by the second. She was suffocating, trapped in this strange, dark dimension, unable to escape. The air itself was thick, and the ground beneath her feet felt like it was slowly shifting, like the very island beneath her had a life of its own, one that was slowly tightening its grip on her. The energy in the space pulsed again, this time more violently. Clara's heart raced as she realized the force was not just pulling her, it was feeding on her, using her to fuel its own existence. The curse was not just an entity, it was an entire system, an ecosystem built on sacrifice, built on the belief that power could be harvested from suffering. And now, Clara was part of that system, whether she liked it or not. The chest had unlocked something inside her, something primal, something dark that had been hidden away. Clara could feel it stirring in the depths of her mind, a strange, unnatural energy that made her question her very humanity. The island's ancient power was reaching into her, changing her, bending her will to its own purposes. The more she resisted, the more it pushed back, like a tidal wave crashing against the shore. But then, just as she thought she could no longer fight the pressure building inside her, a single thought pierced through the fog in her mind. What if the power of the chest could be used to destroy the island, rather than serve it? What if she could reverse the curse, not just for herself, but for the entire island? The shadows around her seemed to pause, as though they had heard the thought too. It was a daring idea, perhaps even a dangerous one, but it was the only chance she had. Clara focused all her remaining energy on that thought, channeling every ounce of willpower she had left. The shadows seemed to respond, shifting and swirling as if testing her resolve. The air around her crackled with energy, and she could feel the chest calling to her once more. This time, she would not merely touch it. She would command it. She would take back control of the power she had unleashed. And with it, she would break the curse, or die trying. Her mind raced as she drew on everything she knew about the island, the chest, and the curse. It wasn't enough to just close the door. She had to break the system itself, tear it apart from within. The chest was not just a vessel. It was a conduit, a link to the island's ancient power. And if she could sever that link, she could destroy the island's hold on her, on Eric, and on Sarah. Clara took a deep breath and, with a force that seemed to shake the very air around her, willed the chest to respond. She could feel it shifting, changing, as if it were coming alive in her hands. And then, everything went dark. The shadows enveloped her completely. The island had its answer. Clara awoke with a sharp intake of breath, her body jerking upright, as if she had been submerged underwater. The air around her was still thick with the same oppressive energy, but there was something different now. The island, once seemingly alive with a haunting, restless force, had fallen silent. No shadows circled her. No distant figures watched from the periphery. For the first time since she had touched the chest, Clara felt an unsettling calm. It was as though the chaos of the island had been temporarily stilled, as if waiting for her to make the next move. But Clara's mind raced. What had she done? She couldn't be sure, but the sensation she had felt just before everything went dark was still fresh in her memory. The chest, the link to the island's ancient power, had responded to her command. But at what cost? The world around her seemed out of sync, disjointed, as if it no longer followed the same rules it once had. She had broken something, a cycle, a system, a barrier, and now she was left to deal with the consequences. Her first instinct was to find Eric and Sarah, to make sure they were safe, to check if the curse had been lifted. But even as she thought of them, a wave of doubt washed over her. What if she had only delayed their inevitable fate? What if she had made things worse? Clara had been so focused on breaking the curse, on forcing the island's grip to loosen, that she hadn't fully considered the ramifications of what she was doing. This was no ordinary curse. It was an ancient, primordial force that had endured for centuries. Could it really be undone by a mere mortal's will? Clara stood, her legs shaky from the lingering disorientation. The island's landscape, once so familiar, now felt alien. The trees loomed tall, their branches twisting in unnatural angles, as though they were reaching toward her. The beach, too, had changed. The sand was darker now, almost obsidian in color, as if it had been stained by the very energy she had unleashed. Even the ocean, which had once seemed so peaceful, now appeared to churn with an unnatural intensity. The waters rippled with an iridescent glow, casting an eerie light across the shoreline. She looked around for any sign of Eric and Sarah, but the beach was empty. The tide was low, the usual sounds of the waves crashing against the shore were muted, and the sky overhead, once vibrant with the light of the setting sun, was now a dull gray. The air felt thicker than ever, pressing against her skin as if it were alive. It was as if the island itself had absorbed the energy she had forced upon it, and now it was waiting to see if she would be the one to break free from its grip or become another part of its endless cycle. Clara's heart sank. The curse was not something that could simply be broken with a single act of defiance. She had known, deep down, that it was never going to be that easy. And yet she had been desperate to save herself, desperate to save her friends, desperate to find a way out. But now, it seemed that the island had shifted again, and she was no closer to understanding what it truly wanted. A sound broke through the silence, a faint cry, distant but unmistakable. Clara's pulse quickened. It was Sarah's voice. She didn't know how she knew, but she could feel it. Her friend was out there somewhere, but was Sarah still the same? Was she still the person Clara had known before they had come to this cursed place? The island had changed them all in ways they could not yet understand. What had become of Eric? Was he even still alive, or had the island claimed him, as it had claimed so many others? With renewed urgency, Clara began to move, her steps quick but cautious. She couldn't afford to waste time. The longer she stayed here, the more the island seemed to close in on her, its grip tightening once again. As she ventured further into the dense jungle that bordered the beach, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the island was aware of her every move. It was as though the very air around her was watching, waiting for her to make the wrong decision. And Clara had made so many wrong decisions already. The trees seemed to close in around her as she moved deeper into the jungle, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The path ahead of her was obscured by thick underbrush, but Clara pressed on, determined to find Eric and Sarah. She couldn't bear the thought of losing them. She had to fix whatever had been broken, or risk losing them to the island forever. As she walked, the world around her seemed to shift once more. The jungle became darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The deeper she went, the more Clara felt as though she were moving through a nightmare, a space where time and reality bent to the whims of an unseen force. Every step she took seemed to pull her further from the safety of the beach and closer to the heart of the island's curse. And then, just as Clara was beginning to lose hope, she heard another sound, a whisper, low and indistinct. It was coming from ahead, from deep within the jungle. She wasn't sure if it was real or just a product of her exhaustion and fear, but the voice sounded familiar. Clara! It whispered her name, sending a shiver down her spine. She had to find out who, or what, was calling her. Clara pushed through the underbrush with renewed resolve, the whisper echoing in her mind as she moved. She had no idea what lay ahead, but she knew that whatever it was the key to understanding the true nature of the curse, and perhaps how to break it once and for all. Clara's heart pounded with every step she took deeper into the jungle. The whisper was louder now, more insistent, pulling her forward as though it was an invisible hand guiding her. The air around her had grown thick with humidity, but it wasn't just the heat that made it hard to breathe. There was a suffocating pressure, an oppressive force that seemed to weigh down on her chest. The island had always felt strange, but now it felt alive, conscious, as though it was aware of her every thought. She stumbled through the underbrush, her legs scratched and her arms bruised from the sharp twigs and branches. The sound of the whisper kept her moving, even as her body screamed for rest. She couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The voice, so familiar yet distorted, was calling her towards something that might hold the answers she so desperately needed. As Clara ventured deeper, the jungle began to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The further she went, the more unnatural the landscape became. There were no sounds of wildlife, no rustle of leaves or calls of birds. The air was eerily still, as though even nature itself was holding its breath. It was as if the island was waiting for her to unlock some ancient secret. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking, Clara emerged into a small clearing. The whispering stopped abruptly, and for a moment, she felt an eerie sense of calm settle over her. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone structure, its surface covered in moss and vines. It looked ancient, older than anything she had seen before on the island. Its design was unlike anything she had encountered. No smooth edges, no symmetry, just a jagged, almost chaotic formation of stones stacked upon one another. There were no windows, no doors, just an open archway leading into darkness. Clara hesitated at the threshold of the archway. The air around it felt colder, as if it was drawing the warmth from her very body. The stones seemed to hum with an energy that she could feel deep within her bones. She had to go in. There was no choice. The voice had led her here for a reason, and she had to face whatever lay within. With a deep breath, Clara stepped through the archway and into the darkness beyond. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world seemed to shift again. The clearing outside vanished, replaced by an infinite expanse of blackness. There were no walls, no ceiling, just an endless void that stretched out in every direction. For a moment, Clara felt as though she were floating, suspended in time and space. And then, a figure appeared before her. It was a man, or something resembling a man. His form was obscured by shadows, his features indistinct and ever-shifting, as though he were made of smoke and mist. Clara felt a chill run down her spine, but she couldn't move, couldn't look away. There was something about him that felt both familiar and alien, something that made her blood run cold. The voice, his voice, spoke to her once more, this time from within her mind. "You've come far, Clara. Too far, perhaps." The voice reverberated through her skull, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. She had heard this voice before, but where? Who was this? The figure stepped forward, his shadowy form stretching as though it were made of the very darkness itself. His eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a pale, unnatural light. "You've awakened what should never have been disturbed," the voice continued. "This island, this place, it is not meant for your kind. But now that you've come, now that you've broken the seal, there is no turning back." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had been right. This wasn't just a curse. It was something older, something far more dangerous. This was the true power behind the island, the force that had been waiting for someone like her to come along. She had thought that breaking the curse was her way out. But now, it seemed that all she had done was unleash something far darker. "You do not understand what you have done," the figure said, his voice like a slow, aching sigh. "You have awoken the guardian of this place, the one who binds the island to the world of the living. And now that the bond is broken, the island will consume you, just as it has consumed all who came before you." Clara's mind raced. The guardian of the island? Was this creature the source of the curse, the force that had trapped them here? She had no answers, no understanding of what was happening, only the undeniable certainty that she was in the presence of something beyond her comprehension. "But there is still time," the figure continued. "There is still a chance to put things right. You must choose, Clara. You can leave, return to the world you know, or you can stay and face the consequences of your actions. The choice is yours, but be warned, neither path is without its cost." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't think, couldn't decide. Her mind was clouded with fear and confusion. How could she make a choice when she didn't even understand what was at stake? But then, as the figure's words hung in the air, something else stirred within her, a realization, a glimmer of understanding. The island had always been alive, always been watching, waiting for someone to break its chains. She had come here seeking an end to the curse, to escape the endless cycle of despair. But the island had no intention of letting her go. It had used her, manipulated her, drawn her in with promises of freedom. And now, it was time to face the truth. There was no escape from the island. There never had been. The only choice Clara had was whether she would be consumed by it, or whether she would become its new keeper. In the silence that followed, the figure stood before her, waiting for her decision. The weight of her future hung heavy in the air, and Clara knew that whatever choice she made, her life, her very soul, would never be the same again. Clara stood motionless, her mind whirling as the figure before her waited patiently, its presence more ominous with every passing second. The weight of the decision pressed heavily upon her chest, threatening to suffocate her. In that moment, the island itself seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation, waiting for Clara to make a choice that would determine her fate. There were no more illusions of freedom, no promises of escape. The island had shown her the truth, and now it was asking her to confront it. The figure's eyes, those eerie, glowing orbs, bore into her soul, its gaze unyielding, as though it could see everything within her, her fears, her doubts, her deepest desires. Clara felt the oppressive weight of the island's history pressing down on her. The countless souls who had come before her, all bound to this place by a force beyond their understanding. She was just another in a long line of intruders, but unlike the others, Clara had broken the seal, had disturbed the ancient equilibrium that had kept the island's power contained. Now, she was faced with the consequences of her actions. Leave, the figure had said. Return to the world you know. But was that even possible? Could she leave the island after everything that had transpired? Could she go back to her life, to the normality she had once known? After encountering the horrors that lurked within this cursed place, the island had already marked her. She could feel it deep in her bones, the unnatural pull that connected her to the land, to its secrets. Leaving would not be as simple as walking away. Stay, the figure had warned, and face the consequences. What consequences, Clara wondered? Was it truly a choice between life and death? Or was the island offering something more insidious? An eternal imprisonment? A life bound to its will, its guardian, its curse? If she stayed, what would become of her? Would she be lost to the island, forever transformed into something unrecognizable? The uncertainty of it all terrified her. But what frightened her more was the growing realization that the island was not simply a prison. It was alive, sentient, feeding off the fear, the confusion, the choices of those who stumbled upon it. And it wanted her. The figure's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. Time is running out, Clara. The longer you hesitate, the stronger the island grows. It is feeding on your indecision. You must choose. Clara's hands trembled at her sides. She was acutely aware of the darkness surrounding her, the vast void that stretched out in all directions. There was no sense of up or down, no anchor to reality. The only certainty was the figure before her and its cryptic words. She wanted to scream, to fight against the pull of the island, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing to hold on to. She felt small, insignificant in the face of something so immense, so beyond her understanding. But then, a thought struck her, something she hadn't considered before. What if the choice wasn't about escaping or staying? What if it was about accepting the island's power, acknowledging its place in the world? What if the only way to break the cycle of fear and suffering was not to run from it, but to embrace it, to take control of it? The idea was radical, terrifying, but Clara couldn't deny that it resonated within her. "You've already broken the seal," the figure said, its voice a low murmur. "You've already unleashed the island's power. There is no going back from that. But there is a way forward. You can choose to become its keeper, to take my place and ensure that the island's power remains contained. But it will come at a cost. The power you wield will consume you, transform you into something different. You will never be the same again." Clara's heart raced at the suggestion. The idea of becoming the island's guardian, of holding its power within her, was both alluring and horrifying. The responsibility, the burden of it, weighed heavily on her mind. Could she truly take on such a role? Could she live with the knowledge that she would be bound to the island for eternity, just as the figure had been before her? But as Clara considered the alternative, the reality of her situation became clearer. To leave the island, to try and escape, would mean death. There was no going back to the world she knew. The island had already marked her, had already begun to twist her fate. The figure before her was right. There was no escape. There was only acceptance. Only the choice to embrace the island's power and control it, or to let it consume her completely. The figure took a step forward, its form becoming more solid, more corporeal, as though it were trying to make itself real in her mind. You will never be truly free, Clara, but you can choose how you serve this place. You can choose to wield its power, to protect it from those who would disturb its balance, or you can let it overtake you, let it destroy you as it has done to so many others. The choice is yours. Clara closed her eyes, her breath steadying as she thought. There was no escaping the island's grip, but she could control her fate. She could become more than just another victim, another name lost to the island's curse. She could become its protector, its keeper, its master. The power was hers to wield, if she was willing to pay the price. With a deep breath, Clara opened her eyes, her decision made. "I will stay," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I will become the island's keeper." The figure nodded, its form shifting one last time, as if satisfied. "Then, Clara, you will take your place among the island's guardians. You will protect its power, ensure its balance is maintained. But remember, every choice has its cost. You are no longer the person who arrived on this island. You will never be the same again." Clara nodded, accepting the consequences of her decision. The island had claimed her, but she would not be its victim. She would become its master. As the figure disappeared into the darkness, Clara felt a surge of power course through her veins. She could feel the island's heartbeat, the rhythm of its ancient power pulsing beneath her skin. The whispers of the past, the cries of the lost souls, faded into silence. She was no longer afraid. The island was hers to command now. And as she stood alone in the void, Clara knew that she had made her choice. The price had been steep, but the island had never been about freedom. It had been about power, and now it was hers. Clara's decision had been made. She had chosen to remain on the island, to accept its dark power, and take the mantle as its new guardian. But as she stood there, her body trembling with the energy that flowed through her, the island's grip on her was already beginning to solidify in ways she hadn't anticipated. The immense force that coursed through her veins was both exhilarating and suffocating, and she realized that she was no longer just a part of the world she once knew. The island had become her world, and the world outside was fading from her grasp. The once ominous figure had vanished, leaving Clara alone in the unending expanse of the island. The air around her was thick with the weight of centuries, the ancient echoes of the island's power reverberating through the very ground she stood on. The sounds of the ocean, the cries of birds in the distance, the rustle of leaves. Everything seemed muted, as if the island itself was withdrawing from her perception. Yet at the same time, Clara could sense it all, could feel every shift in the land, every tremor in the earth beneath her feet. The power was hers to command, but it was also beginning to redefine her, reshape her into something else. For the first time since her arrival, Clara felt truly isolated. The world she had known, with all its complexities and relationships, was now a distant memory. The people she had loved, the friends she had made, the life she had lived, all of it seemed like a dream, slipping further from her reach with each passing second. She was becoming someone else, something else. The island's influence was not merely a physical transformation. It was psychological, emotional, and spiritual. It seeped into her very being, changing the way she thought, the way she perceived the world. She could no longer escape the fact that her choice had sealed her fate. In the solitude of the island, Clara could feel the weight of her new role pressing down on her. She had thought that by embracing the island's power, she would somehow find peace, or at least control. But now, she was overwhelmed by the enormity of what lay ahead. The responsibility was far more complex than she had imagined. It wasn't just about guarding the island. It was about maintaining the balance, ensuring that its power didn't fall into the wrong hands, preventing others from making the same mistake she had. The price of freedom was far higher than she had understood, and it was a price she would pay for the rest of her life. As she wandered deeper into the heart of the island, Clara began to realize the true nature of the power she had inherited. It wasn't just the ability to control the island. It was the power to shape it, to mold it, to make it manifest in ways that no one had ever dared before. The ancient guardians had kept it hidden, kept it dormant, but Clara was different. She had broken the seal, awakened something that had been slumbering for centuries. And now, she was left to navigate the complex web of consequences that came with it. With each step, the island seemed to respond to her presence, its energy pulsing through her body, filling her with an overwhelming sense of purpose. But it also filled her with dread. The land was alive in a way that she had never known. It wasn't just a place. It was an entity, a living, breathing force that had its own desires, its own will. And now, those desires were intertwined with her own. She had become one with the island, but the cost of that union was still unclear. The more she walked, the more Clara felt herself being drawn into the island's deeper, darker corners. There were places on this land that she had never seen, places that even the figure had not shown her. There were places where the island's power was most concentrated, where its influence was strongest. She could feel the pull, could sense the hidden depths of the land, as if it were calling to her, beckoning her to explore its secrets. But Clara knew better than to give in to that temptation. She had learned too much to trust the island blindly. She had seen what had happened to those who came before her, and she knew that the island was not a benign force. It had its own will, its own purpose, and it was not always in alignment with hers. She paused at the edge of a cliff that overlooked the vast ocean, the waves crashing violently below. The island stretched out before her like a labyrinth of shadows and light, each path fraught with uncertainty. Clara felt a pang of sorrow as she realized that she could never go back. She could never return to the life she once had. The world she had known was gone, erased by her own decision. There was no going back from this. But as the wind howled around her, Clara realized something crucial. This was her destiny. She had chosen to embrace the island's power, to become its guardian. And with that choice came an unshakable truth. She would never be free again. Not in the way she had once understood freedom. The island had taken everything from her, her past, her future, her sense of self. But in return, it had given her something far more powerful. It had given her control. She was no longer a mere wanderer, lost on an island. She was its master, its keeper, its protector. The price had been steep, but Clara knew that there was no other path for her. This was the price of eternity. The island had consumed her, yes, but Clara had also consumed it. And in doing so, she had found something she hadn't expected: purpose. The island was no longer an alien force to be feared. It was a part of her, and she was a part of it. Together, they would endure, and together, they would face whatever came next. The burden of eternity was hers to bear, but she would bear it with strength. The island had claimed her, but she would not be its victim. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Clara stood tall, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The winds whispered through the trees, and the island seemed to pulse with life, as if it were alive, aware of her presence. The journey was far from over. The consequences of her decision would unfold over time, and there would be challenges ahead, challenges she could not yet comprehend. But Clara was ready. She had made her choice, and she would live with it. The weight of eternity was heavy, but it was hers to carry now. The island and its power were hers to control, for better or for worse. And in that moment, Clara understood. The island had not taken everything from her. It had given her something even more profound: the power to shape her destiny, to craft her own path, to become the master of her own fate. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift of all. Clara stood at the edge of the island, gazing out at the endless expanse of water before her. The ocean stretched far beyond the horizon, a dark and turbulent force, just like the power that now coursed through her veins. The winds had shifted, howling as if they too recognized the gravity of the moment. She had been on the island for what felt like an eternity, bound by the ancient force that had chosen her, or perhaps the force that she had chosen. Now, after so many twists, so many battles, and so many internal struggles, Clara faced the ultimate decision: to stay and rule the island for all time, or to sever her bond with it, giving up the power that had become a part of her very soul. The figure who had first confronted her in the dark labyrinths of the island's heart had long since disappeared, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. She had thought that embracing the island's power would bring peace, that it would somehow ease her pain and uncertainty. But in the end, it had only created a new kind of conflict, one far deeper than anything she had ever experienced before. She was both the island's protector and its prisoner. There was no escape from the responsibility, and yet, there was a profound peace that she had found within herself. She had become something more, something greater, but she had lost so much in the process. The temptation to leave was overwhelming. Clara thought of the world outside, the cities, the people she had known, the places that no longer seemed familiar but still lingered in her memory. She thought of the life she had lived before, one filled with ordinary human experiences, like laughter, companionship, and moments of fleeting joy. She had longed for a sense of belonging, and at one point, she had believed that she could find it on this island. But now, she understood that the island could never truly give her that. It had offered her something else, something much more profound, but also infinitely more isolating. The island was a powerful, living entity, and it had chosen her not because of her strength, but because of her vulnerability. Clara had seen that vulnerability in herself all along. She had been afraid of her own weakness, afraid of confronting the darkness inside her, the parts of her that had always felt out of place in the world. The island had given her the power to confront that darkness, but it had also amplified her fears. And now, with the power she had gained, Clara had to ask herself, was it enough? Was the island's influence truly the source of her power? Or had she merely used it as a means to escape the fear of facing her own weaknesses? As the night descended upon the island, the sky darkened with a heavy, oppressive silence. The stars shone faintly above, barely visible against the vast, endless darkness. In the stillness, Clara felt the weight of all the choices she had made, the consequences of every step she had taken. The island had shaped her, but she had also shaped it. The two were now one, forever intertwined. But Clara knew deep down that this was not the end. The island's power would continue to influence her, whether she stayed or left. She would carry it with her, just as she would carry the island's memory. Her mind flickered back to the first time she had encountered the figure, the mysterious, ancient being who had told her of her destiny. Clara had come to the island as a seeker, looking for something she couldn't quite name, hoping for something she could not understand. She had thought that by accepting the island's power, she would find clarity. But instead, it had brought only complexity, forcing her to confront the parts of herself she had long tried to ignore. The island had never been a place of simple answers. It had always been a mirror, reflecting the darkness and light that existed within her. It was a force that showed her who she truly was, not who she thought she was. And in that revelation, Clara found both terror and strength. The decision before her was not one that could be made lightly. To leave the island would mean to relinquish everything she had become, to cast aside the power that had reshaped her. But to remain would mean an eternity of isolation, of living within the confines of the island's strange, unyielding force. She would be bound to it forever, her every thought and action influenced by its will. Clara could never truly be free, no matter what she chose. But perhaps that was the lesson the island had taught her. True freedom did not come from escaping the bonds of responsibility, but from accepting them fully and without hesitation. As Clara walked along the shoreline, her feet sinking into the cool, damp sand, she thought of the people she had once known. She had loved them, yes, but now that love seemed distant, like a dream half remembered. Could she ever truly return to the world she had left behind? Could she return to being human, with all its frailties and complexities? Or had she already transcended that, becoming something more, something beyond human? The question gnawed at her, but she had no answer. The truth was, Clara had already made her choice. The island had claimed her, and now she claimed it in return. There was no going back. The moon rose high in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows across the beach. Clara stopped at the water's edge, staring out at the ocean. It was vast, limitless, and beautiful, but it was also indifferent like the island itself. The world was so much larger than the tiny patch of land she stood on, and yet it felt as if the island had become her entire universe. The power it had bestowed upon her was not something that could be easily discarded. It had become part of her, woven into the very fabric of her being. And yet, she was not trapped by it. She had become its equal, its counterpart. The island and Clara were one. In that moment, Clara understood that there would always be darkness, always be a struggle. But the island had given her the strength to endure, to confront the fear and the unknown. It had shown her that true power did not lie in control, but in acceptance, in the willingness to embrace both the light and the darkness that defined her. The decision was no longer a matter of whether to stay or go. It was a matter of how she would live with the choice she had made. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the cool breeze on her skin. And for the first time in what seemed like forever, she smiled. The island had shaped her, but it had also freed her. And now, she was ready to face whatever came next, no longer as a seeker, but as a guardian, no longer as a wanderer, but as one with the island, its power, and its legacy. The choice had been made, and Clara was no longer afraid. The island was hers, and she was its. Together, they would face eternity.